Okay, monitoring and oversight, what's good information? And you know, this is a very basic question, right? And unless you're getting good information, it's going to be hard for you to make good decisions as trustees. So a very important question, and a good one to start with a Dilbert cartoon for, I think. So this is the no trolls approach to information sharing, a la Dilbert. In order to make an informed decision, you need to know as much as I know. Now, of course, this is the staff talking to the board, right? That's impossible. So instead, by mutual implied agreement, I'll feed you some lies that point you to the right decision. If we don't upgrade our servers, a herd of trolls will attack headquarters. And the board says, no trolls, no trolls. So as I go through this set of ideas and slides and points, think a little bit about what your board's decision-making process is like. I think too often there's not enough thought by the board given to what the decision-making process is like. How does this board get to decisions? What does it have before it? What does it ask for when it doesn't have what it thinks it needs? How does it interact with each other in a process to get to decision A, B, or C? So I hope we can spend a little time this morning thinking together about that in general, but with your own model of how your board reaches decisions in your mind. This is, again, a quote from the Consequential Boards report by AGB from 2014, critical of the accounting system for higher education as opaque. We don't have agreed upon protocols for defining cost centers, even basic things like distinguishing between costs and revenues, parsing unit level costs by instruction and discipline, assigning overhead costs. Now, you know, this is a national report. I think there's some truth to it. I think what Mary Knight described, at least in the UT system, and by extension in Texas generally, I think you're out ahead of this. So feel good about that. At the same time, can we improve wherever we are? I think, I mean, the kind of cost of that professor teaching that class is still pretty much a black box for folks. In some instances, because we don't agree on what the data are that should be looked at to reach that number. In other cases, because it's so complicated that boards and others have a hard time understanding how we get there. Too much board time and attention goes to perfunctory review, routine report outs. We talked about this already. Not enough time on strategic focus on cross-cutting issues and some of the other big topics. So boards need to work with institutional leadership to re-examine resource use and academic program costs, make better use of data for benchmarking performance. Further, boards must develop sophisticated understandings of educational effectiveness and educational outcomes and learning outcomes. So one question I'd pose to you here is the question of who are the genuine peers of your institutions, right, in terms of other institutions? And each of our institutions has aspirational peers, people they'd like to be more like, and then there's sort of the more realistic current peers that we have. And one of the things we've found in looking at information, if you get the right source of information, is you learn a lot of things about how you're performing in relation to people who have missions, student bodies, budgets, degree program arrays, capital facilities like you. And deciding with your leadership who those people are, who those institutions are, focusing on them to say, well, we really could be doing a better job with retention, I think. It's not just that the students we get don't allow us to do that, because look at this other institution that get the same kind of students, have about the same budget, same programs. They're doing better. So what do they know that we don't know? Those kinds of conversations based on that kind of use of information can be very helpful. And I don't know, Mary, how much the coordinating board is sort of helping to underwrite some of those conversations between institutions as they work on the 60 by 30 plan, but you've got such a big state with so many institutions, you're ripe for having those kinds of cross-institutional conversations focused on those goals, right? And again, that's the report.
And that report is on the materials website.
Right, if you'd like to look. So, what should you know and why? And this is adopted from a piece that our Sheila's friend of mine, Tom Meredith, put together a couple years ago. And let's start with the why, where I think we should start. So, thinking here of you all as representatives, those of you who are trustees of the people of Texas, here's some things I think you should do. You want to make sure the dollars in your institution or system are spent effectively and efficiently. This is, the fundamental prudent man or woman responsibility that we talk about in fiduciary work. Need to watch the debt levels closely, both institutional debt and student debt. And of course, we're having this huge national conversation around student debt now. Each of the presidential candidates has a plan to address it. And, we could talk about the reality versus what's in the media, but the fact is that for many of our families, the sticker price we've gotten to even in public higher ed in many instances, and the debt burden that they're hearing about even in public higher ed is high enough to discourage them from sending their kids to school, or the kids saying, I can go and do it. If you're in Wisconsin making $43,000 a year and you've got 3 kids and you're looking at, 20 grand a year to send the student tuition, room, board, books to UW-Madison, you're probably going to think twice, especially if you're being told that the average debt that students from the University of Wisconsin system have now is about $28,000. So that's $28,000 among the 75, average among the 75% of students who have debt. 25% in Wisconsin still graduate without any, but among the 75 who do, about 28,000, which pales when you hear the projections that if somebody who has a college degree now is likely to make close to $1 million more in salary over the course of a long working life than somebody who has only a high school diploma. But if up front, you're making $43,000 a year for a family of 3, that $28,000 debt along with the 20 grand a year looks insurmountable. So we have to come up with better ways of talking about sticker price and actual price and debt and all that, but something that you should all be looking at and talking about. Again, making sure that physical facilities are maintained and new ones are built when needed, and this is a basic responsibility. And one of the things around this one that a lot of boards have begun to focus on is, well, in the age of online education and more internships and cooperative education, do we need the same number and level of buildings that we used to? Now, I think the answer to that, if you look around most campuses, is yes, we do. And there's kind of a tension here, right? Lots of people as taxpayers will say, well, I don't know why we're building that big fancy dorm and have this big fancy meal plan and got the rock climbing wall, and why do we, is that really essential? But what we find is when those same taxpayers are on tour with their kids who are looking to go to the school, they say, where's the rock climbing wall? The school down the block here has one, right? And boy, their meal plan looked a lot better than yours. So this goes to the conversation boards need to have with their leaders on their campuses about, well, what's your business plan? Where do you want to act more or less like a business? How far do you want to go in treating students as customers, and all those good conversations? Make sure the employees are cared for. I think we all know that organizations succeed or fail or fall somewhere in between to the extent that they have the right personnel with talent and commitment in the right jobs. And again, as the board, making sure with your president you've got the right personnel system, the right salary level that will allow you to attract and hold on and care for employees is really, really important. And as universities, we do operate in an international talent market. Lots of big companies do. We do too. And having the right ways to attract employees from around the country and from around the world and hold them is a really important responsibility that boards need not to do, but need to make sure the administration has plans in place to do. Again, we talked a little bit about quality already, essential feature of any institution that the board has to be comfortable you know is there, and your administration has ways of testing that it's there. Be sure the institution deals with suggestions of regional and programmatic accrediting bodies. That relates to the continuing quality, and that may mean sometimes reading and discussing those accreditation reports when they come in at the board level. Have assurance that students are provided the assistance necessary to complete their education as soon as possible. This is another issue of completion and pathways. It always amazed me, when we'd announce a tuition increase of $300 a year, $150 a semester. People would say, "Oh my God, it's too much. We can't afford it." But then you'd have people saying at the same time, "Well, I think I'm going to stay another year. I'd like it, and I didn't get this other course I wanted." Now, sometimes that was our fault, right? Didn't have the courses available, but sometimes it was just kind of the culture, really. More and more students we know are more relaxed about that progress through in 4 years than some of us used to be. So, but knowing how your administration is focused on completion in what amount of time is very important, I think, for boards, and the statewide plan can certainly help keep the focus on there for you. Safe and living in a healthy environment, that's the least you can do, the sort of an obligation that's the least you can do for your students. One of the things I think of now, given what's happened in the last year in our campuses around sexual assault, it's clear that there are a fair number of students who don't feel safe in that way and are not living in the healthiest environment in that way. And again, we're a microcosm of society in that regard, and lots of boards around the country have spent lots of time dealing with sexual assault policy in this last year because of that. Make sure the institution has a viable strategic plan, that it's being followed. Again, that's about tracking those metrics, and make sure your institution's making progress on the 60 by 30 Texas strategic plan, or else Mary will be calling you every Monday morning saying you're falling behind. Okay, let's switch to the what you should know beyond the sort of broad philosophical stuff. So I think this gets at the notion of decisions needing to be data-driven, as Roberto said this morning. Good, useful data, and we'll talk about what I think some of that is. Accurate and consistent so that you can do comparisons over time, so you're not in a situation where the categories of data you see from one year to the next are all mixed up and bollocksed up and different and you can't compare. Again, and having that consistency and accuracy is about building trust with the board. The management needs to use it, quick response, trend lines, peer comparisons we talked about. And then as board members, when you have good data in front of you, thinking, what are the good questions based on this data I should ask of the management of the institution? And the president of the Texas Tech system gave you some good suggestions this morning about good questions. But don't ignore the subjective either. Need all that good data, but we also need to know what they add up to in terms of the stories, the narrative, the experience that our students, faculty, and staff are having. I always like Senator Daniel Moynihan's expression that data is the plural of anecdote. And there is some truth to that, and you've got to look at both of those. So here are some specific things I'm suggesting it's good for boards to know. Again, compared to legitimate peers, the cost by category per 100 FTE students to educate them, and 100 is just a comfortable round number that often gets used. The administrative staffing per 100 FTE students. The real cost of athletics, and again, Mary was emphasizing that at her institution, athletics is a self-supporting entity, and that is true, I'm sure, at some level. I mean, I think one of the interesting things to think about here is, well, who pays for all the buildings that the athletic activities take place on? Who pays the heat, who pays the air conditioning, who pays for the light, who pays for the security. I mean, there are all sorts of interesting questions there about self-supporting or not that sometimes are not a bad thing to think about when you think about athletics. Compared to peers, the staffing ratio per 100 FTE students by institutional category. And by institutional category, I mean they're community college, four-year institution, research university. Again, compared to peers, income from tuition and fees per 100 students. And that, you know, that often can provoke a good conversation about what's your pricing philosophy at your institution. Do you want to be at the top of your peers around the country? Do you want to be in the middle? Do you want to be closer to the bottom? And of course, that then provokes a conversation about, well, what's our financial aid philosophy? And how much do we get from the federal government? How much do we get from the state government for financial aid? How much of it is need-based? How much of it is merit-based? How much are we seeking to raise every year in need-based financial aid from private philanthropy? All sorts of good board-level questions can come out of that. The salaries compared to peers are really important. Again, this is the whole thing of the talent market that you oversee in these universities and the mobility of a lot of it. Faculty, especially the best faculty, often feel free to move around the country, if not internationally, if they think they are going to be treated at another institution or another state better than they are in Texas. So you need to keep your eye on how you are doing in comparison with other states, especially. Financial health, you know, how's the budget working? Categories for spending, debt load, reserves, et cetera. On the last item, reserves in a public institution are important and different from a private institution. And you know, you want them not too low, right, to be responsible, but you want them not too high either, because you can get criticized, especially if you're raising tuition. We had a little of this in Wisconsin, and you have what look to people like pretty healthy reserves, and especially if you have a big system and those reserves at each campus are all added up and you come out with a really big number and people say, oh my God, look at all this money they're storing away. So one question there is, you know, does the board have policies on what the reserves ought to be or not, and do you track them? Audit reports we already talked about. You need to have an audit committee or at least a part of a committee, a subcommittee that pays a lot of attention to those in terms of your own due diligence about the reputation of the institution. Activities that boost the economic development of the state and region. You know, more and more our universities are being looked to as economic engines. I think much more so than it used to be in the past. In a competitive knowledge economy, people are looking to us to spin off new services, products, to be connected to the workforce development policy in the state in terms of the kind of folks with what skills we're producing from our graduating classes. So more and more attention, I think, needs to be placed there than used to be true in the past. The success of private fundraising. You know, when I started as president, so it's about 13 years ago now, some of our four-year and master's campuses really didn't have much of a development function. They just, as public institutions, didn't think, well, they needed to do all that much of that. But at the end of my tenure, 10 years later, they all had robust development and advancement offices, and that was something that the chancellors had to do at those institutions to build them out. And increasingly, that was one of the metrics I looked at with each chancellor and with the board to say, how'd they do last year, right? How much money did they raise, from whom, for what purposes? So the board needs to be paying attention to that as more and more of the operating budgets of our public institutions come from non-public sources. What happens to your graduates? This is, you know, again, much more highlighted than it used to be. That can be job placement rates, it can be acceptance rates at graduate and professional schools. The federal government and other governments are wanting more information on that. You know, what's your job placement rate from this institution. And again, this is very tricky and worth a conversation. You know, we are, what I would say is, are we in universities preparing people for jobs? Yes. Are we preparing them for their first job? Yes, but we're really preparing them for a career of work. So unlike, say, a two-year technical college, which is much more focused on specific skill preparation for a job that hopefully that student will be able to step out and go right into, the university's bottom line there is a little vaguer, a little longer term. And I always like to remind my board when they be talking about this, think of all the companies that are major American and international companies now that weren't invented when you started college. I mean, 20 years ago or 30 years ago, you said, we're going to prepare you to work in Google. Well, you didn't, because Google wasn't around, right? So we are looking always at the immediate job placement, but also the longer job placement. The viability of academic programs and centers. Most boards do have to approve new academic programs. Some boards look at the discontinuance of programs. Centers, you know, there's always questions there about are they valuable, are they delivering, given the funding that's put under them. And again, one of the things that I think is healthy is for your chief executive to come before the board once a year, and even though you may have approved each new academic program serially as it came forward, to say, okay, here's a summary. Here's all the new academic programs you approved in the last year, and here are the discontinuances or suspensions that we had in this last year. And in our system, we didn't have to bring those discontinuances to the board, and so they always thought, boy, you people are just adding all these programs all the time. You never stopped doing anything. Well, we did, and once a year I'd remind them of each program we had either discontinued or suspended. And generally, the numbers were roughly the same. That is, the numbers that were discontinued were about the numbers that were started, new programs. We had already talked about accreditation findings and performance evaluation process for your employees, making sure that, again, the administration is doing that in a way that every year everybody gets an evaluation. Some of my colleagues would say in years where we got no salary increase, well, why do I have to do my performance evaluation? I'm not getting any salary increase. Say, well, you are getting a salary. Your salary continues this year, and your performance in terms of what you're doing for that salary does need to be evaluated. Pass rates on national licensure exams, good sort of comparable stuff across the country that you ought to know. The quality of your incoming freshmen, and that really is, you know, what's your admissions policy and standards, what's your admissions culture, and that will be different depending on the kind of institution where you are a board member. And for the Higher Education Coordinating Board, I think part of the goal there is to have a variety of institutions in the state that have different admission standards and are dealing with different student bodies, therefore, and trying to bring them up as far as they can. Transfer rates and successive transfers. So one of the things we know now, right, is that's different from the past, is that many more students, when they get to their degree, have credits from more than one institution. This is what they call a student swirl phenomenon. I mean, students are, in that sense, treating institutions, and this bothers some of us, but treating institutions much more like commodities, or learning more like commodities. You know, I can get 3 credits here, I can get 6 credits online there, I can go down the street to the other place because they're offering a course at night and take 5 credits there. And that's not going to change. And knowing that puts a premium on transfer policy so that students who are doing that are not disadvantaged by needlessly having to take courses that teach them things that they already learned at another course, but that other course just happened to be at a different institution. Diversity of the student population and faculty and staff. This relates directly, especially in a big state like Texas with a diverse population, immigrant population, relates directly to the completion agenda, right? Unless we do a better job with students from underserved backgrounds in the big states like Texas, we're not going to get to our completion numbers. And We also increasingly have a wider range of students from different ethnic and religious and national backgrounds, and the faculty and staff who teach them need to look like them, for them to feel like, okay, I'm in a place that understands my background and can take me to the next level. So again, boards, none of us is perfect in this area, but boards need to be paying attention and asking questions about that. Graduation rates and retention rates. I think retention rates, especially first to the second year, where often we can lose a lot of students. Remedial courses and the success of students after they take remedial courses. We still in math and English/reading have lots of remedial credits being taught, and they need to be for some students. This is all about, getting a better connection between what needs to happen in K-12 and post-secondary, but we're a long way from having that connection perfectly done. So we have many students who come in needing some remediation. At your institution, do students, after they take the remedial courses, go on and be successful in the credit-bearing courses if the remedial courses don't have credit? More and more people nationally are saying, well, the right way to do remediation is you give students partial credit or credit for a course, but do remediation embedded in the credit-bearing course. Lots of conversation about all that now that a board could inform itself on. The number and percentage receiving financial aid, we already talked about that. An interesting number for boards to know is, what's the average price that a student actually pays at my institution? Not what the listed sticker price is, but what's the actual average price a student pays, and how is that, the mean and the average, all divided up around those numbers. Debt loads we talked about. Trends in out-of-state enrollment. This is an interesting one, and I don't know how you work this exactly here in Texas in terms of being able to charge out-of-state students more dollars, and more of our in-state institutions in some places are looking for those out-of-state students because they need the revenue. And then there's a tension between, oh my God, if we keep getting more out-of-state students, are we going to have enough places for our in-state students? Some states or institutions have caps on systems, caps on out-of-state enrollment. I don't know what you have here. Is it capped? Differs by program. So again, that's a sensitive political topic that, again, boards at least need to be aware of what the policy is and hopefully be able to defend it. Average salaries after graduation versus debt load by institution and discipline. There's more and more information out there because external groups are looking for it. You ought to know it. The collaborations that your institution is in, this goes to economic development and transfer and everything else, new product development, really important. Enrollment trends by level, major and FTE, the success of your online offerings, progress on your statewide report. Well, are you feeling overwhelmed? This is an awful lot of stuff. And some institutions will need to focus on some parts of this more than others. But I don't think there's anything on here, and you tell me if you think it's true, but anything on here that you as a trustee or a regent would not want to be somewhat conversant on if somebody at the cocktail party says, well, what about that? Who are you partnering with in this area? Which institutions do you partner with? Where do you get most of your transfer students from? Or how many online offer? How many courses do you offer online? Do you offer any degrees fully online? What is, if somebody graduates with an engineering degree from UT Arlington, what's their average salary after they graduate? Now that one, you'd probably say, well, I don't know, but I can find out. But we are tracking that kind of stuff, right? So how to get started in this whole area? I think knowing what metrics are now used, asking about the dashboard, indicators among all of those kinds of metrics I mentioned, maybe the top dozen or so that the board agrees on and wants to really be kept apprised of on a regular basis. You all from the outside world looking in may have some very good input to say, well, I think this is really what parents want to know, or this is really what the business communities want to know, or you've got the right basic information, but you're not displaying it or characterizing it in a way that's easily interpretable by the audiences that should be looking at this. And you all as a board need to arrive at an agreement on what that exactly is, what you need to be an effective board in the way of information. So that's the monitoring and oversight and good information thoughts that I have. Let me open it up and see what reactions or questions you might have about that. Do you? Yes. University of North Texas, and your name?
I'm
Yep.
my name is A.K. Mago. I'm a regent at UNT. You have mentioned about the debt load almost on every slide. My question is, how do you expect the board to address it, except either lower the tuition fees? And if you lower the tuition fees, you don't have enough money to pay to your faculty, and they go someplace else. And one of my suggestions will be to all those students who take the debt, work. Work in the morning, go to evening college, work in the evening, go to morning college. That's what I had to do to get my degree. I was working in the morning, going to college in the evening.
Good for you.
Okay? So I think we need to offer a little more options and suggestions to these students that you don't have to take that. Just work few hours somewhere. Because we are encouraging them to go on for 5 years, 6 years just to complete their degree, that they should do it in 4 years.
Mm-hmm.
So again, that will be my suggestion. Say, give student a chance. Say, if you can finish in 3 years, we will reduce your tuition fee.
Mm-hmm.
And see how many students are willing to take that offer.
Mm-hmm.
And suggest them to take courses where you can get a good job. Because many times you have a bachelor's degree, but it's of no use whatsoever. It's better to go to a community college and have a skill in auto repairs, and you can make $70,000, $80,000 a year. So we are not encouraging them to do that. When it comes to engineering colleges, you have more foreign students there than you have local students, particularly when it comes to master's and doctorate program.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know how the board can accept through their president and send this message.
All interesting ideas, and thank you for sharing a little bit about your own background. And we certainly have lots of students who are working part-time now. There's been a huge increase in the number of students who are doing that at some level. I think a lot of this, in my mind, goes to where you were going, adequate advising early on. I mean, so many students, especially if they're the first in their family to ever go to college, really don't have much of a sense of what's out there and how they would move through it. So working with the schools, laying out more clearly what options are for folks is one thing. And you know, a lot of the real horror stories on the student debt you hear, these folks who are, you know, living in their parents' basement and they have $125,000 worth of debt, are people who've kind of made bad choices given their family income very often about where they're going to go to school. And you know, lots of friends in the private school world, but for some students who really are financially stressed, you can get as good a quality education at a public institution at a third the price very often as you can at a private. And that needs to be taken into consideration more too. When you see the horror stories of the big debt, often that's part of it. You know, if I had my druthers on this, what we'd really be doing is we'd have a better coordinated financial aid system so that, you know, for certain, and I'll say this about myself. For myself, for what I would pay to send my kids to UW-Madison at the salary I was making as president is really too low. I mean, I couldn't send my 4-year-old to daycare in Madison for what I would pay in tuition at Madison, right? So there's a portion of the society that can afford to pay the sticker price, and then there's a portion that needs some help, and having a more calibrated financial aid system, money available in financial aid to help those families that can afford, or students who can afford, and helping them to put packages together with that kind of a financial aid system that may involve some work. Now, one of the problems with work is it can delay graduation. If it didn't for you, good for you. So you just worked 20 hours a day between work and school. But there you go. There you go. And you know, some people are able to do that and do it, and I admire that. So at any rate, I think having a financial aid system that really does help the students who can afford it, and helps in using it to direct them into more appropriate institutional and programmatic choices. And you know, one of the good stories here is I think we do have more choices now for students who may start at a community college or a technical college, get a welding certificate or an auto repair or a basic computer science degree, and then figure out later in their career, well, if I want to buy the shop, or if I want to be a shift supervisor working in the computer operations center, I'm going to need an associate degree, or I'm going to need a baccalaureate degree. How do I go back and get it? We have many more options of those kinds now that make it easier for students and cheaper to graduate without debt initially, but then after they really are out in the workforce, come back and complete. One interesting model like that I'll mention is something we did in Wisconsin called the Bachelor of Applied Studies. I like to call it the upside down degree. So 2 of our campuses, UW Green Bay, UW Oshkosh, in the northeast part of the state, partnered with the Northeast Technical College and said, we'll for students who graduate from Northeast Tech with a full degree, an associate's, they have in effect a major in a technical area, we'll recognize that at either UW Green Bay or UW Oshkosh as their major, and they'll do their general education in their junior and senior years. Right? Most of us start with the general education and then narrow down to the major if we're in a traditional baccalaureate degree. So this kind of turns that on its head. The specialization is in the first 2 years, and then you broaden out in the junior and senior year. And that was a way to, again, let people who knew they needed to get a baccalaureate degree, who were working mostly in technical areas in the Fox Valley, still a heavily manufacturing region of Wisconsin, go on and get that baccalaureate degree without wasting a lot of credits, without spending money they didn't need to spend on their educations. And by the way, one of the side benefits of that, we found, was the faculty, who were, not surprisingly, kind of resistant at first in doing this, and this is something I pushed pretty hard from the system. The faculty liked it. Why? Because the students they were getting in their general ed courses weren't, the freshmen out of high school saying, why do I have to take this writing course? These were working adults who were out there saying, wow, if I'm going to get to be a shift supervisor in this engineering place, I'm going to have to know how to write. I have to do performance evaluations where I write about what my fellow workers are doing. So they found more engagement by those older students in many instances in their general education courses than they might from a more traditionally aged student. So I think all of that and more we need to look at. It is one of the biggest problems we face, I think. We're saying we need to get many more of our citizens through a degree if we're going to be internationally competitive. And we know we've slipped back. We're now about 14th in the world in terms of the proportion of our population with a post-secondary degree. We used to be first. We're slipping back farther. We've got to change that. At the same time, tuitions, partly because states have been pulling money out of higher ed, continue to ratchet up. So we've got these vectors, right, that are going in opposite directions, and we got to figure out how to harmonize them. Mary, we're done with harmonizing now. We're done with the session. Okay. Thank you.